So hi everyone, welcome to our LA County Library virtual event, Books and Brunch, The Truth About Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Biz Tanner, and I'm a librarian with LA County Library. Today we welcome Iris Ilagan, who will be talking about fairy tales, a genre with fantastic written and oral traditions, and a personal favorite. Iris is LA County Library's children's nonfiction selector. She previously managed the Leland R. Weaver Library in the city of Southgate and the Paramount Library in Paramount. She has worked as a children's librarian in the La Cañada Flint Ridge, Stevenson Ranch, and Hermosa Beach communities. She was a library assistant, a library page, and she's also been a bookseller. Obviously, she's a professional bookworm, and she says she was born with a book in her hands. If you have any questions for Iris, please share them in the chat found on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be writing them down and moderating the Q&A with her at the very end of the program. Please let me know if you have technical difficulties and I'll do what I can to resolve them. Last, but certainly not least, if you're interested in seeing more of our upcoming virtual library programs, please visit our virtual programs page at lacountylibrary.org. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Iris. So Iris, take it away. I'm going to put your presentation back up and off we go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. That everyone's well and enjoying the holiday season. Like Biz said, I'm Iris Ilagan and I'm the Children's Nonfiction Selector at LA County Library. I'm very excited to be here and discuss culture and all things fairy tale with you. But first, I'd like to give a shout out to a couple of people, to the library assistants at Manhattan Beach Library and Linwood Library, Mark Raya and Ramon Mares, for helping me retrieve so many books in the last few weeks. I contacted them so many times to request books for this project. So thank you so much for your patience. So the PowerPoint is up? Okay, let's start. Let's go down the rabbit hole and over the rainbow, as they say, to Once Upon a Time. So I'm the Children's Nonfiction Selector, and you might ask, why? What's a nonfiction selector doing talking about fairy tales? Next slide, please.
Sorry, my computer's not cooperating. There we go. Sorry. Okay.
All right. Our nonfiction collection is kind of a misnomer because not all books in this section are considered factual. For example, we shelve books about Bigfoot and Sasquatch in the unexplained phenomena section. Graphic novels you'll find in the arts section. Plays and classic literature like the Odyssey and the Iliad will be in the 800s, which is our literature section. And ghost stories, so the person who earlier said he likes Aswang ghost books. Ghost stories like the ever popular Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, which is constantly checked out and requested by kids. And the rest of those books in the series are in social sciences, along with, next slide, fairy tales and folk tales. Let's talk fairy tales. What are the defining characteristics of fairy tales? A fairy tale is a category of folk tale that features magic, enchantment with supernatural beings, supernatural tasks, supernatural power, or magical objects. It doesn't have to feature fairies in it. It's usually a short narrative that's verifiably old because it's been passed down for generations. It's a story that suspends natural physical laws and is understood to be fictional. So a lot of people think it should be categorized as fiction and shelved in that collection. But at LA County Library, we use the Dewey Decimal Classification System, which means that folktales and fairy tales are shelved in nonfiction. That probably didn't answer the question, so you might be still wondering why. The Dewey system allows for subject-related browsing. And because folktales tell us something about the worldview and experience of older societies and cultures, fairy tale books stay in the social sciences, which is the branch of science devoted to the study of societies and the relationships among individuals within those societies. They're part of the folk narrative and are considered useful resources by social historians and anthropologists. Folktales and fairy tales have their roots in the oral tradition and were meant to convey some wisdom or information to the audience. In olden times, people looked for signs in nature and from living creatures to explain their own lives, and they created stories as explanations for questions like, what is thunder? What is lightning? Why does the sun rise and set? So fairy tales show us what people used to believe in and explain behaviors of people in certain cultures. Reading these stories now connects us with others and gives us an idea about the cultures where they came from. But where do these stories really come from? You guys know that the Brothers Grimm are from what is now called Germany, right? But I'd like to do a quick survey to see how much you really know about arguably the most popular collectors of fairy tales and their stories. Next slide, please. Okay, Grimm's fairy tales. Are they of German origin or not? A, true, B, false, or C, it's a bit more complicated than that. I think Biz will put up a poll in the chat. If you don't know where the chat box is, it's on the right, bottom right-hand side. Just click on where it says chat, and I'll give you a few seconds to hit submit, and Biz will show us the poll results. Did anybody answer? Okay. Okay, it looks like the overwhelming answer is C. It's a bit more complicated than that, and yay, you guys are right. All these fairy tales, even though they're considered German folklore heritage, actually some stories originated from other cultures. Next slide, please. In the first edition of Grimm's Children's and Household Tales, and you can see the German title right there. I can't, I've tried to say it, but I can't say it with a German accent, so I'll just say the translated title is Children's and Household Tales. The brothers relied on all sorts of people who either told folk tales to them or wrote them down as they themselves heard them. From well-educated middle-class young women who relayed French fairy tales to a tailor's wife, the person named Dorothea Vieman. Her family had originated from the Netherlands, so that her repertoire of stories was actually somewhat international. They also heard stories from different classes of people, from aristocrats as well as peasants and craftsmen, poets, and even soldiers. Next slide, please. Fairy tales have long been studied by literary scholars and anthropologists. Academics like Maria Warner, Jack Zipes, Maria Tatar examine plot structures and themes, and they talk about the symbolic power of these stories in their lectures and books. We have some of these in our collection. Next slide, please. Marina Warner evaluated the fairy tale as literary form in her very influential Once Upon a Time, A Short History of Fairy Tale. Next slide, please. Jack Zipes is the only person who has ever translated the 1812 and 1815 versions of Grimm's Children's and Household Tales. So all of the translations before that were translated from the much more sanitized version of, I think it was 1958. Next slide, please. Maria Tatar was the author who published those annotated treasuries that were really awesome. I'm a librarian, so I remember when those annotated versions first came out, and I'm not sure if you guys remember too, but she published the annotated classic fairy tales, Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, Peter Pan, and the annotated African American folk tales. There's a really interesting YouTube recording of a Zoom talk that she did on fairy tales. And if you're interested in watching it, the link will be included in the email we send you after the program. In the video, she discusses the agency of female characters. In earlier stories, how it goes is if you have a nice dress and if you can weave well, you will find your prince eventually. But there were some stories that were different. In particular, stories like Bluebeard. We were talking about Bluebeard before we started the program, about women who married monsters and who were engaged to monsters and how they discover the history of their husband's crimes. And what do these women do? They usually, in the end, have a big dinner and they tell the story of their husband's crimes. Tatar calls this the early Me Too movement, because these stories told women that there is a way out, but you're gonna have to broadcast your story. She also mentions Bruno Bettelheim and his study on the uses of enchantment, how children process their feelings of anger and their emotional life, that seething cauldron of emotions that Freud talks about, and how fairy tales kind of restore their faith in the possibility of a happily ever after. So we think of fairy tales like fantasy novels and science fiction as escapism, an escape into fairyland, into other worlds. But when we come back with tools that we use for ourselves. And this is what literary academics try to unearth, the ways that symbolic stories help us navigate reality and figure out who we are, navigate problems, tools that help us solve these problems and start communicating with each other. So the way I see it is literary scholars study the ways that the reader interprets stories as well as the intentions of the author. There's a focus on the individual relationship between a reader and a story, or between an author and the audience. What do we get out of our readings? What do the authors or storytellers want to communicate? How can we use the wisdom gained from these stories in our individual lives? Anthropologists, on the other hand, study fairy tales in relation to what differences mean. Where did these stories originate, and what does that mean about the collective people that they came from? Next slide, please. Anthropologists use folktale indices in their research. There are a few of them, but the big one is a catalog called the ATU Index, and that's a list of folktale types used in folklore studies. It's a massive categorization system that's attempted to squeeze every Indo-European folktale and fable into a category with a number and a name. And you can see on this slide, this reference identifies more than 2,000, actually 22,399 international folktale types across the world. ATU stands for Arn, Thompson, Uther, which are the names of the three main scholars who have produced the index and then revised it. The original was Auntie Arn in 1910. He created this index. In 1928, it was expanded by an American folklorist named Stith Thompson. And in 2004, it was further revised and expanded by Hans-Georg Uther, a German folklorist. You see the 7 major categories: animal tales, tales of magic, religious tales, realistic tales, tales of the stupid ogre, anecdotes and jokes, and formula tales. It's really helpful trying to find different versions of the stories that we know, or discover types of fairy tales that we don't know. It categorizes fairy tales around the world according to their plot. So a story of a girl wearing red and who gets into trouble with a predator who's usually a wolf will be filed under ATU type 333, the Red Riding Hood tale. And stories about mischievous little creatures with secret names who trick people into taking their babies or wives would be filed under ATU 500 for Rumpelstiltskin type tales. Let me break down the Red Riding Hood ATU number for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first digit, that first 3, is for the major category, Tales of Magic. Under Tales of Magic, the first subcategory is stories with supernatural adversaries. These are the stories number 300 to 399. And among these, tale type number 333 is the Red Riding Hood type. So each tale type has a number and a name, and some of these types are just called by their most famous variants, like ATU 333 for Red Riding Hood tales. Others are very strange and funny. Next slide, please. These are just some of my favorites. For example, ATU 34 is The Wolf Dives into the Water for Reflected Cheese, or ATU 678, The King Transfers His Soul to a Parrot, and ATU 1718, God Can't Take a Joke. I think they're hilarious. I can take a joke. A story that falls under the ATU type 214, the one that's called Donkey Tries to Caress His Master, goes like this. Let me read you the story. A farmer one day came to the stables to see his beasts of burden. Among them was his favorite donkey that was always well fed and often carried his master. With the farmer came his lapdog, who danced about and licked his hand and frisked about as happy as could be. The farmer felt in his pocket, gave the lapdog some dainty food, and sat down while he gave his orders to his servants. The lapdog jumped into his master's lap and lay there blinking while the farmer stroked his ears. The donkey, seeing this, broke loose from his halter and commenced prancing about in imitation of the lapdog. The farmer could not hold his sides with laughter, so the donkey went up to him and, putting his feet upon the farmer's shoulder, attempted to climb his lap. The farmer's servants rushed up with sticks and pitchforks and soon taught the donkey that clumsy jesting is no joke. Another fable that was categorized ATU 214 is the donkey story in India's The Panchatantra about a donkey who ran around stealing cucumbers with a jackal. He wanted to sing after getting full one night, and even after the jackal told him, no, you can't do that because people will hear you and they'll catch us stealing food. But the donkey insisted until the jackal said, okay, fine, go ahead, but let me go hide first. So the jackal goes and hides, and the donkey starts to sing. And when the farmers heard him, they caught him and they beat him. Next slide, please. Research has suggested that these stories are actually thousands of years old, and many anthropologists have done a lot of work trying to trace their roots back in history. One tale, The Smith and the Devil, can even be traced all the way back to the Bronze Age. In this story, a blacksmith makes a pact with the devil, or death, or jinn, usually a supernatural being, selling his soul in exchange for either money or talent. When it's time for the devil to take his soul, the blacksmith uses something that the devil had originally given him and tricks or forces the devil to let him out of their contract. The Grimm brothers actually had this story in their first book from 1812, but they didn't include it even in the 1815 version. They didn't include it in any of the later editions. In another version of the story, the blacksmith was a very good man, like the best man in town, and the devil tricks him into murdering someone. The story from Russia, the version from Russia, the blacksmith didn't sell his soul, but he keeps spitting at and knocking his hammer on an image of the devil so that the devil got angry and did the same thing, got revenge on him. Anthropologists show how narrative traditions are not only transmitted vertically from ancestral populations to their descendants, but they also spread horizontally as a result of trade or conquest between neighboring cultures. And recently, an anthropologist, Dr. Jamie Tarani, and a folklorist, Sarah Grace da Silva, they started using phylogenetic methods. It's actually used in phylogenetics is used in biology to study evolution and the diversification of species. So in biology, we use phylogeny to show that humans and apes share a common ancestor, but they've evolved into distinct species. With fairy tales, these two scholars have used the same method to investigate the relationships between the stories and cultural phenomena like languages, marriage practices, and political institutions. So by comparing the folktales from different cultures and knowing something about the historical relationships among all those cultures, they were able to make inferences that would have been told by their common ancestors. Next slide, please. Dr. Tarani's work on the phylogeny of fairy tales is really fascinating. One example is his study of 58 versions of Little Red Riding Hood from around the world. So we all know the story. Most modern versions are adapted from the story that was written down by Charles Perrault. In Perrault's version, the story ends with Red Riding Hood being eaten by the wolf, and that was it, the end. Many believe that Perrault's story is based on an older folktale that was called The Story of Grandmother. In The Story of Grandmother, unlike the later Red Riding Hood tale, there's no hood, there's no nickname. It's just about this young woman who gets caught by a wolf, and she manages to trick him into letting her go outside to the toilet. The wolf ties a rope on her ankle, but she cuts it and ties it to a tree and escapes. Another variant of Red Riding Hood is the Catarina story, in which she's taking a basket of cakes to her aunt or uncle, who turns out to be a werewolf. On the way there, she gets hungry and she ends up eating all the cakes and replaces them with donkey dung. And when her aunt finds out what she had done, she comes to her house at night and devours her in bed. There was a prominent folklorist, Alan Dundes, who had previously said that there was no material from before 1697, when Charles Perrault first wrote down the story, that's related to Little Red Riding Hood. But in 1992, a Harvard University professor of medieval Latin, Jan Ziolkowski, discovered an 11th century poem written in Latin by a priest from Liege in Belgium that's very similar. So it seems that there was a Red Riding Hood story already circulating in Western Europe in medieval times. This one tells of a girl who wanders into the woods, and she was wearing a red baptism tunic given to her by her godfather. She encounters a wolf who takes her back to its lair, but she escapes by taming the wolf's cubs. Then there's the East Asian story, The Tiger Grandmother, in which a group of siblings spend the night in bed with a tiger who is posing as their grandmother. They hear their youngest sibling being eaten, so they trick the tiger into letting them outside to go to the toilet, and they manage to escape. Another story is from Central and Southern Africa and tells of a girl who was attacked by an ogre after he imitates her brother's voice. In some cases in this story, she's cut out of the ogre's belly alive, similar to the story variants in Europe, including the famous Brothers Grimm version. In the Brothers Grimm, the huntsman cuts open the wolf's belly, and Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother both spring out from its open body alive. Then they fill up the wolf with large, heavy stones while he was still sleeping. I don't know how he could have slept through that. And when he woke up, he tried to run away, but he was too heavy and he dropped down dead. Next slide, please. So Little Red Riding Hood is ATU 333. There's another tale type, ATU 123, that has similar elements. It's called The Wolf and the Kids. It's a story that's popular throughout Europe and the Middle East. It's about a nanny goat who warns her kids not to open the door while she's out in the fields, but they're overheard by a wolf. So when she leaves, the wolf impersonates her and tricks the kids into letting him in, and he devours them. Although these two variants, Little Red and the Wolf and Kids, are believed to be related to each other somehow, they're classified as separate international tale types because of two things. First, ATU 333 features a single victim who is a human girl, and ATU 123 features multiple victims, a group of siblings who are animals. And second, in ATU 333, the victim is attacked in her grandmother's house, while in 123, the victims are attacked in their own home. Next slide, please. So again, instead of just using the historic geographic approach with the ATU index, Dr. Tarani started using phylogenetics, and this involves a mathematical modeling process that compares similarities between the plot variables and scores them according to the probability that they have the same origin. And out of those scores, a tree is constructed showing the most likely paths of the evolution of the story. In his phylogeny, he traces the story into three main groups. The study identified Little Red Riding Hood, the story of grandmother, and Catarrhinella as a single tale type. If you guys can see the cluster of red dots on this tree on the right-hand side, CAT stands for Catarrhinella, RH for Red Riding Hood, and GM for the story of grandmother. And they found that the earliest known ancestor of the Red Riding Hood type that they can tell is the medieval poem from Latin from the 11th century. So if you can see within that cluster is a red dot that says Liege, because that's where the poem came from. The African tales, the one with the ogre who imitated the brother's voice, those turned out to be descended from the Wolf and Kids. If you can see the upper cluster on the tree with the green and blue dots, those depict the Wolf and Kids, WK. And those stories are connected to the Africa stories. And they have found that the earliest known ancestor for the Wolf and Kids is an Aesop fable, first recorded around 400 AD. So you can see there are two green dots on the bottom of that cluster that say Aesop. The third group of stories, the one from East Asia, the last cluster of purple dots on the bottom left, formed a separate group, and there were no indications that they can be classified with either Red Riding Hood type or the Wolf and Kids type. So Dr. Tarani thinks that the best explanation for this is that the East Asian tales were a product of the two other groups, and that the tiger grandmother from East Asia represents a hybrid type. But questions still remain about how, when, or where the two types of international tales were adopted and combined. So we have the European version, who tells the story of a little girl who's tricked by a wolf masquerading as her grandmother. In the Asian version, there's a tiger instead of a wolf. In Iran, the story features a little boy instead of a girl, probably because in Iran, little girls aren't allowed to just traipse about in the woods by themselves. Contrary to popular belief that this tale originated shortly before Perrault wrote it down, Dr. Tarani found that the variations of this story share that common ancestor dating back more than 2,600 years. So you can see that just like a biological organism, the story has subtly changed and evolved. Because many of these fairy tales weren't written down until much later, they've been changed and misremembered and retold through generation after generation. But key concepts remain the same among all those stories: the dangers presented by predators, the importance of following a parent's instructions. Looking how the folktales have spread and changed tells us something about human psychology and what sorts of things people find memorable and want to pass on to others. Next slide, please. Next slide. Let me show you this awesome book by Paul Fleischman and Julie Pashkis. It's called Glass Slipper, Gold Sandal, A Worldwide Cinderella. It combines elements of the Cinderella story from different cultural traditions across the world and expertly puts them into one narrative. The narrative is just super seamless. So I thought I would read a few pages to you and show you how they incorporate lines from different cultural versions and created one universal story. Biz, am I on the screen now so they can see the book?
You know, I will stop sharing the PowerPoint for a minute so they can really see you nice and big.
Okay, cool. All right, so Glass Slipper, Gold Sandal. I'm just going to show you one spread. So here in Russia, you can see the names of the countries where each part comes from over here. In Russia, when the girl was out tending the cattle, the beasts heard her crying for hunger. "Don't weep," said one of the cows, and the animal poured honey for her from its horn. In Iran, a fairy gave her figs and apricots. In India, Godfather Snake gave her rice. And in Ireland, when she was eating well and proper, the girl bloomed into a right rare beauty. The stepmother couldn't fathom it, and meanwhile her own sour-faced daughters would curdle the milk if they looked at it twice. You can also see how the illustrator used traditional images to differentiate between the nations. Thanks, Biz. This duo, the author and illustrator, they also published two other books in the same vein. First Light, First Life is their worldwide creation story, and Fearsome Giant, Fearless Child combines different elements of Jack and the Beanstalk from all over the globe. But I think this one is, for me, it's the best out of the three. Next slide, please. Okay, let's do another poll. Now that we've talked about ATU types, what ATU type do you think Rapunzel falls into? And for the purposes of this program, because we don't have that much time, I just focused on the Tales of Magic Index because most popular fairy tales fall under this category. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few seconds again, and then Biz will show the results of the poll.
We've got lots of people who are just still chiming in, so I'm giving it a minute.
Oh, okay.
All right, I'm going to close the poll.
Cool. Okay, it looks like for the people who answered, most picked Troll or Enchanted. Actually, this story falls under supernatural adversaries because of the witch who traps her in the tower. Next slide, please. Okay, so this story, Oh, can you go back one? I think we skipped one. Yeah, okay, so this story is actually called the Maiden in the Tower Tale type. It would be in the ATU 300 for Tales of Magic category, and the subcategory is Supernatural Adversaries, because her godmother, the witch, which are in the 300 to 399 numbers, and 310 is the specific Maiden in a Tower type. In this international tale type, it's not the long golden hair or stealing from a garden or the witch for a godmother that's the significant motif, even though those elements may be seen in many of the different stories. It's the entrapment of a girl in a tower that's the significant motif. This is the common cultural denominator that connects Rapunzel variants across the world. Next slide, please. So let's look at a few of those Rapunzel variants. This is just a few of them. There are many more Rapunzel stories around the world, but let's with the Grimm's version. Rapunzel begins with a husband and wife who wants to have a baby, and the wife, they get pregnant. The wife starts to have intense cravings for the Rapunzel plants growing in the garden of a neighbor. The German word Rapunzel translates loosely to English as field salad or lamb's lettuce. The husband steals away into the garden of the neighbor who happens to be a witch, but in earlier versions, she's referred to as a fairy, and in later ones as a sorceress. So the husband steals the Rapunzel for his wife, but this only satisfies her for a bit, and soon she starts begging for more. And again, he sneaks into the neighboring garden, but this time the fairy or the witch is there and catches him. She lets him have the Rapunzel, but only in exchange for his child. And once the wife gives birth to the baby, the witch appears and snatches the child away, naming her Rapunzel after the plant. Rapunzel grows into a beautiful young girl, but when she turns 12, the witch, who is often referred to as Frau Gothel, suddenly locks her in a tower with no doors or stairs. Frau Gothel is sometimes also referred to as Mother Gothel. It's a generic term for godmother in Germany. But we can also interpret it as a reflection of a Christian versus pagan theme in the story. The Goths, which is the derivative of Gothel, they were a Germanic pagan tribe until they converted to Christianity in the 7th century. And Frau, or mother, on the other hand, can be associated with nurture and goodness. So Frau Gothel can be seen as both an evil kidnapper witch and a childless fairy desperate for motherhood. So back to the story, Rapunzel soon meets the prince who, after watching the fairy enter the tower, learns the magic words, and he says, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And she lets down her hair and lets him in, and they soon become lovers. But Rapunzel blows their cover, and she asks the witch one day why her clothes no longer fit her body. She doesn't realize she's pregnant, but the witch does. So in a rage, the witch chops off Rapunzel's beautiful hair, a symbolic loss of innocence, and she banishes Rapunzel into a distant wilderness as punishment, where she eventually gives birth to twins. The witch then waits for the prince to return and call up to Rapunzel. She lets down the hair that she chopped off, and the prince climbs up. Horrified not to find Rapunzel at the top, he throws himself from the tower and loses his eyesight in the fall. And after years of ambling blind around the forest, the prince somehow manages to find Rapunzel and the twins, and her tears of pure joy miraculously heal his eyes, restoring both his eyesight and their happiness for years to come. And the witch inexplicably is never referred to again. This was the 1812 version. Wilhelm Grimm revised this to make it more appropriate for children and families. He deleted any reference to sexuality or suggestive behavior to keep with the conservative values and demands of his time. So in the 1857 version, instead of asking why her clothes no longer fit her, she just blurts out that the prince is much easier to hoist up than you, godmother. So this story is actually a great example of one of the tales that the Grimm brothers have popularized as part of the German folkloric heritage, but actually had different origins. The two brothers acknowledged that their story was based on a 1790 version by Friedrich Schultz, released in Leipzig, but the Schultz version was actually a loose translation of an earlier French story called Personette, written by Charlotte Rose de la Force in 1698. And that story was also influenced by an even earlier Italian story called Petronella from 1634, which was written down by Giambattista Basile. In Petronella, there's a mother. There was just a mother, no mention of a husband. Pascadozia, she stole from an ogress who was her neighbor. She stole parsley instead of Rapunzel. Petronella is the Neapolitan equivalent for the word little parsley. And then, unlike Rapunzel, Petronella escapes with 3 magic acorns, and she uses these to stop the ogress from chasing her and the prince. 1 acorn becomes a ferocious dog, the second a raging lion, and then the ogress is finally defeated by the 3rd acorn, which turns into a wolf and gobbles her up. It's interesting that there was no father figure in this version, maybe to lead the audience to speculate that the mother became pregnant out of wedlock, and so she was punished because of it. This was published in the Baroque time period when Christian themes were common. So we can also view the tower as a convent, because girls from that time were often sent to convents until it was time to either marry or for them to become nuns. But another interesting aspect for me is that the fact that Petronella wasn't helpless and passive like Rapunzel. She actively defeated the ogress with the magic acorns. In Personette, which was based on Petronella, the fairy truly loves the baby. She was present for the birth of the baby. In fact, she even helps the mother give birth, and she wraps up the baby in gold sheets and anoints her with magic ointment to make her the most beautiful girl in the world. And then she takes her and raises her in a silver tower, and the story pretty much is identical to Rapunzel from that point until the end, when the fairy realizes she still loves Personette and decides to use her magic to transport her, the prince, and the twins to the prince's kingdom. An interesting story about the writer, Charlotte Rose de la Force, was that she fell in love with a young man and attempted to marry him without parental permission, and this was a no-no in French society around that time. It was a time when arranged marriages were the norm. She was one of the authors of that time period who were progressive proponents of consensual marriages based on love. So as you can see in Personette, she made the antagonistic authority figure, the fairy, be moved by the couple's consensual love, and she helps them in the end. The African version is called Lulia and the Ogre with Green Chickens. This story comes from Egypt. In this one, the protagonist is male. A young man named Yusuf is cursed and has to find a woman named Lulia. Yusuf was told of an ogress who knew where the maiden was, but that he must only approach her, the ogress, if she's surrounded by green chickens with her breasts thrown over her shoulders and her hair a mess. The first time he couldn't approach her because she was surrounded by regular chickens, but the second time the signs were all there. The ogress tells him how to find Lulia's tower, but that she's guarded by her father, who is another ogre. And when the two run away from him, they were helped by magical items, just like in Petronella. But in this version, a pin creates a field of thorns, and then her comb becomes a huge hedge of bamboo, and finally her mirror becomes a great lake. And the ogre makes it past the first two, but he explodes from drinking all the water in the lake. So Yusuf and Lulia end up successfully escaping to his kingdom. In the introduction to Folktales from Egypt, where this version was collected, it explains that in the olden days of Egyptian society, parents weren't nearly as lenient towards their children as they are today. So a girl was essentially forbidden to even look out the window. So with this in mind, we can view this story as symbolism of the resentment of a young man over her father's overprotectiveness. The ogress also might have historical roots in older Middle Eastern religious beliefs. There was an Arabian goddess named Al-Azusa, who's described in some sources with her breasts thrown over her shoulders. And the green chickens most likely reflect the old custom of painting farm animals in celebration of the Egyptian New Year. Another story, the one of Saint Barbara, might have been an early influence of Rapunzel. In her legend, her father locks her up in a tower in an attempt to make sure she doesn't become Christian. She was from what is now present-day Turkey or Lebanon. In her tower, she uses a rope, not hair, to raise and lower a basket that her father would fill with food and necessary amenities. but she ends up converting to Christianity somehow anyway. And once her father finds out, he seizes her beautiful long hair and beheads her. And at that moment, her body supposedly erupted in mystical flames, and her father was appropriately struck dead by lightning. So within the Catholic culture, Barbara is known as the patron saint of prisoners because she was one herself. She's also the patron saint of miners and those who work with explosives because of the lightning association. And she's portrayed with miniature chains and a tower. Another early possible influence of the story can be found in the Shahnameh, the Epic of Kings saga by the Persian poet Ferdowsi. In one part of the Shahnameh, Zal and Rudabeh fall instantly in love just from hearing about each other. And when they meet for the first time, Rudabeh is standing on the roof of her home instead of a tower. Rudabeh tells Zal she gives him many blessings from heaven, another religious influence in folklore. Zal asks if he can come up, and Rudabeh loosens her long hair, letting them fall to the ground. She tells him to climb using her hair, but he refuses, worrying that he might hurt her. So he uses a rope instead and swings himself up and covers her hair with kisses. A difference from other versions that you see here is the respect that he gives her hair, which we could interpret as a reflection of the culture's attitudes towards the tradition of courtship or towards women. Another variant with religious influence that's been collected in 2002 by John Beerhorst in his anthology Latin American Folktales, Stories from Hispanic and Indian Traditions, is a Colombian fairy tale known as Mother and Daughter. In this story, a mother's daughter, Maria, dies young, but she was good and she was a virgin, so she goes directly to heaven. And the mother soon passes too, but she finds herself in purgatory. The mother can see her daughter up in heaven, and she calls out, "Daughter Maria, spotless as snow, let down your hair for your mother. Then as fair as you were and now are, you'll be fairer than any other." So Maria bends down and lets her hair fall into purgatory, and the mother climbs to the top, and she's purged of her sins somehow and reunited with her daughter. So we see how different cultures adopt and appropriate fragments of the story into their own canon, and which aspects remain throughout. In Rapunzel, we see the desire for sexual freedom, the desire for offspring, the bond between mother and child, and the blossoming into womanhood. We see many of the same plots in the oral traditions associated with different and often widely spread societies and ethnic groups. Scholars have made theories about past migration and cross-cultural contact because of the similarities in the fairy tales, but they also show that there are universal aspects of the human experience that we see, and that these universal truths shine out through the stories that we tell ourselves and our children. And all these truths change over time as well. We see it on the page as we read different adaptations of our beloved fairy tales. In the Brothers Grimm, the first edition, the stories were bizarre and brutal, and they were intended as a collection of stories about children rather than stories for children. And by the time the final edition was released, the stories had changed. They were way less gruesome and violent. Next slide, please. Folklore and fairy tales reflect the opinions and morale of the time also. Let's take a look at current stories. Women are being brought into the forefront of retellings now, not just as princesses or characters that need to be saved, but rather as strong, independent women. We see this in both books and movies, with the popularity of Disney films like Moana, Frozen, and Tangled. Next slide, please. And we see them in modern picture book retells. These are some of my favorites. They're written by Bethan Wolven. Her retellings feature shrewd and resourceful heroines who rescue themselves with not a prince in sight. In her first book, Little Red, we see no bloodshed on the pages, but we do see Little Red holding an axe and wearing a shaggy wolf pelt in the end. Just a warning about these retellings, though. If you're a parent or a caregiver and you're not ready to discuss death with a child, please be careful about the adaptations that you choose. Because in Woven's stories, for example, she doesn't explicitly say that any of the characters die, but the illustrations and wording imply that the heroes and heroines have killed the bad guys. Next slide, please. Here are pages from Little Red where we see the wolf about to eat Little Red Riding Hood, but she's holding an axe. And it says, "And the wolf leapt forwards," which might have scared some little girls, but not this little girl. which was unlucky for the wolf. And there she is wearing the wolf pelt. Next slide, please. The importance of diversity and inclusion may also be seen in recent publications, like those worldwide stories from Paul Fleischman that I mentioned earlier. Here's the cover of their most recent book, Fearsome Giant, Fearless Child, which collects the Jack and the Beanstalk retellings. Next slide, please. And Jerry Pinkney's The Little Mermaid was published this year, which also features a strong, independent girl and no mention of the desire for a prince. Next slide, please. Young adult writer Marissa Meyer has reimagined the stories of several fairy tale heroines into a sci-fi steampunk world in her Lunar Chronicles. Next slide, please. And in young adult, there's so many fairy tale retellings now. I can't even begin to list. But there are some great adult fiction writers also who breathe new life into classic fairy tales, and these are a few of my favorites: Neil Gaiman, Angela Carter, and Helen Oyeyemi. And not pictured here, but I have to include Catherine Valente, Gregory Maguire, Tanith Lee, Kelly Link, Kate Bernheimer. Right now, I am reading Helen Oyeyemi's Gingerbread, and earlier, before the program started, we were talking to Sarah about Mr. Fox. I love that one, which was her novel based on the story of Bluebeard, and in which Mr. Fox is a writer who keeps killing off all the heroines of his book. I was going to end the story today with a reading, but I don't think we have time. So take it away, Biz.
Sorry, I just realized I needed to unmute myself. So here, I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint so we can see each other for a moment. Let's see. Sorry, technology, folks. It takes a minute to find where you're supposed to unclick things. Iris, thank you so much. So we would love to take any questions that you might have for Iris in the next, we have just a few minutes together. And to sort of kick things off, Iris, I was wondering if you could tell us what your favorite fairy tale or folk tale that you grew up with was, and sort of how that influenced your life in any way.
So my favorite fairy tale is actually The Little Mermaid. I was 9 when the Disney movie came out, and I was just enthralled by the movie in a good way, because I had read the story before, and the story is very different. Hans Christian Andersen's story is very different from the Disney version. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in his story, he marries a different woman, and when they were all on a ship together, the Little Mermaid is leaning out and crying because she was, sad about the prince and his new wife. Her sisters come up out of the ocean, and they had all sold their long hair to the witch to find out a way to get her back. And the witch gave them a dagger, and they said, the only way you can come back to us is if you place this dagger in the prince's heart. So she was supposed to kill the prince to get her tail back, but she was about to do it and she couldn't because she loved the prince so much. And she just threw the dagger back into the ocean, and she became a daughter of the air, basically like a purgatory for creatures that don't have souls. And she was supposed to get her soul by doing good deeds and become a child of heaven. So that was I mean, when I first read it, I was so young, and I was just like, what is this story? Like, it kind of like scarred me, but at the same time, I was like mesmerized by the story. And then the Disney version came out, and I watched it in the movies, and I'm like, I was very confused. But I think that's when my fascination with fairy tales came about, because I'm just like, that was a completely different story. That's not what happened to the Little Mermaid. Why did you change? So yeah, that's my favorite.
Yeah, I think in popular culture, fairy tales have definitely had some cleaning up or changes that have been made for making it more palatable for younger audiences in these modern times. So we have a couple of questions. One question, and this may be a tricky one, but do you have any adult fairy tales that you recommend? So fairy tale type books for adults. You did mention a few sort of at the end of the presentation. Do you want to talk a little bit more about I think it was Helen Oyeyemi who you really enjoyed.
Helen Oyeyemi, yeah. If you are, whoever asked the question, if you're talking about, new modern fairy tales, then I would really suggest Helen Oyeyemi. She does good work. And of course, Neil Gaiman, he's like the rock star in the adult literary fantasy world. But if you're talking about actual retellings of old fairy tales, there's a book that I've been reading recently called it's not new, it's a little bit older, but it's called The Long Path to Wisdom. And these are stories, fairy tales from Burma. And it's very interesting in the stories from Burma and a lot of, Asian fairy tales. It's not a stepmother, but usually the evil antagonistic figure is the mother-in-law, which is interesting to see the dynamics between these families. What else? I also picked up this book, and I wish I had talked more about it, but it's called Disfigured: On Fairy Tales, Disabilities, and Making Space. So it's this woman who wrote this book. She is disabled, and she talks about how fairy tales have kind of shaped her life growing up with a disability.
Thank you so much. Another question that came in was, is there any relevant literature that you would recommend to go more in depth about the history of fairy tales? Which you and Iris and I know that there's a resource list that we're going to email out to everyone that has some of that. But do you want to talk about you did some really great research into resources. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those titles that are on the resources list that we'll be sending out?
Yeah, so Jack Zipes, I think I mentioned those three literary scholars that I looked up. Those three have a lot of books that we have in our collection, and I've included the books that I looked at on the resource list that we're going to send to you guys. But if you're interested in actually like hearing them talk, if you just put in Google Jack Zipes or Maria Tatar, some of their lectures are available, especially right now in 2020, they made them available on YouTube for people to watch.
Fantastic. We had another question. Why do you think parents are missing so often in fairy tales? One parent or another parent, or maybe they've been replaced by a step parent. Do you have any thoughts about that? It's kind of a deep question, but I thought I'd throw it to you since you've been looking into fairy tales so much. What's your theory, Iris?
That is deep. I mean, I don't know. If you're a child watching have you seen the movie The Willoughbys or read the book The Willoughbys? In that one, it's about these parents who are not there, and they want to basically they want their parents to disappear or whatever. But I think children just that's what they need. The love and attention of their parents is something that we need at an early age, and if we don't get that, where else do we get that? So these stories, because fairy tales are our way, like playing is our way of learning about the world around us. I think it's a way for children to kind of navigate those early questions about what would It's reading literature is our way of it's our way of kind of like making sense of the world around us, and it actually helps us in kind of like navigating those issues that maybe we might not have, and or maybe we do have, and if we don't have them, of how do I say it, but being happy with what we have, I guess, you know, like seeing the world from a different perspective.
I love your take on that. A comment from one of your colleagues at the library, Karen, who said, I once read that the preponderance of stepmothers in fairy tales was a reflection of the likelihood of women dying in childbirth during the time stories originated, which really speaks to what you were saying about children learning to sort of live within the situation that they're in family wise. And for some reason that question made me think about other you know, even in modern literature, if you look at you know, the Harry Potter series, for example, he's without his parents as well, and sort of the struggle that has for him in his life, not having his parents around. And I think that's a really common theme just across literature for children in general, you know, parents either being missing or gone. So it's really interesting because I'm realizing it probably has its roots in fairy tales, and it's really, really interesting. Well, Iris, we're pretty much out of time. I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today. I know you put a lot of work into researching this, and oh my gosh, that was fascinating. It's so interesting. To everyone who came, thank you so much for being with us today. In case you didn't know, this is a monthly program. We do it once a month on a Saturday. It's not totally a regular Saturday, so you just have to keep an eye out for the next one. We're still in the process of scheduling our January program, so look for that in our library e-newsletter, our virtual programs e-newsletter, and on our website, lacountylibrary.org. For the latest library news and events, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at LA County Library. Stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.